Welcome YouTube to this next part of my car design digital modeling series. This part in the series is pretty much for intermediate level users of Modo, but for those new to Modo, I've left the interface pretty standard so you can follow along. But you can as you learn Modo, you can customize it as you wish. My interfaces are usually a little more open. I've hidden a lot of these menus and I use a lot of shortcuts, but for this series I'll um, try and use as much as I can that's in the standard interface. So for this part I'm going to go over some of the subdivision modeling tools I use in Modo. I use these to create new geometry based on the data that I made in Gravity Sketch. I do this so I can focus on creating nice clean geometry that I can modify later to refine and tune the design. Some of the tools I use are in the Topology tab up here. I also cover some of the more traditional modeling tools I use to modify the geometry once I've established new topology. So the first thing we're going to do is import this geometry from Gravity Sketch. So one thing you do in Gravity Sketch is just file, save, or export an OBJ file, and then you're going to open that file, or actually will actually import it. But wherever you save the file to, you'll have this zip file. You also have to remember the name. I think this was the one that I created, and then I just unzipped it. You can extract the files, and it creates this folder here with the same name, which should have your OBJ file, some material tag, and a thumbnail view. So once you have that done, you'll just come up to File, Import, and find that folder. It'll be under your exported sketches. We'll go to that folder, and I think I named that this Sports Car Demo 8, and we will hit Open. Oops, click on it, hit Open. Just give that a second. And you can see that geometry I just brought in here, oops, is under here in this folder. It comes in as a static mesh. Depending on the settings you have, it might come in as a static mesh or a active mesh. You can just right click and change type to mesh, and it'll turn that blue and have it as a mesh. You'll also notice it's rotated 90 degrees. In Gravity Sketch, everything is made Y up. I actually work in Z up. That's how I work in Alias, so I like to kind of keep everything in the same orientation. So the next thing I usually do is rotate the geometry. Actually, first your system might be set up where you have Y up as your default. So under your preferences here, you can come to Units and change that to Y or Z. Actually, I'll just have it at Y for now. So you can see the gradation. The sky is lighter, the ground is darker, but I'm going to work in Z up. I also like to change the OpenGL, the flatness of perspective. I think the default is somewhere around 45. And so when that's set, you can see your perspective is a lot more fisheyed. Right, so if I set that back to 80, you can see it kind of gives it a little more of an isometric view, but with still some perspective. I think it's a little more natural feeling. So that's what I do. I change the units, Z up, and the flatness of perspective. You can also go in here and change your import options or your default units. I have everything set to millimeters. So once you get your model in there, in item mode, you can hit E, pull up the rotation widget, and I know that I have to rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis, and I'm going to come over and freeze that rotation. Actually, we'll just freeze all. Either one should work. And then I'm going to rotate it one more time around the z-axis, -90, and that should be where I want it. I just know from experience bringing files back and forth between alias that my back view is actually my side view. That's one little kind of a preference you can't really change is when you switch to Z up the camera, your camera options. So once you have it rotated, you don't have to do this. You can leave it at Y up if that's the way you want to work, but I prefer Z up. So I already have that mesh there. So I'm just going to delete the one we just brought in, and that's it. I also, if you hit O, it'll bring up your 3D viewport options under the visibility. I actually always have my work plane turned off. I'm just turning it back on so you can see what it looks like, as well as the grid here. Just for this portion, I don't really need them. If you're lining up the vehicle with the grid, you can turn them on to kind of see where you're placing it. But I don't really need them right now, so I'm just going to turn them off. And while I have this open, another thing I do under the active mesh, when I'm in vertex mode, you'll see that the vertices are visible. Under here, I have show vertices in vertex mode. I think the default is always, so when you switch between your different modes here, your edge, polygon, and vertices selection, they'll always be visible, but I only really need to pick them when I'm in vertice mode, so I just use that as in vertex mode. That way when I switch to edges, they're not there, and polygons, they're not there as well. So that's pretty much what I do to set up the scene. The next thing I do is come over to the shading tab. I like to set up some of my matte cap shaders. I'm actually just going to delete that for now so you can see what I do. You can kind of have your own custom material capture shaders for that. So I'll just do add, and under special you have matte cap shader. Just click that. You won't see any of these images here. These are the ones that I've imported, and you just have to click on add clip and load images, and it should open your matte caps folder, or you can go find them wherever you have them saved. These are just some of the ones that I use. These are just more examples of them some that I've downloaded. There's just quite a few in here, but I've made some that I use a lot. I've made these silver paint ones, as well as I took the showroom, diffuse, and photo horizon from Alias. Those are some of their shaders they use for some of their diagnostic shading. So I just use those in here as well, because when I switch between the softwares, it's good to have similar shading. I actually really like the red wax one. It's not too glossy or shiny. It's pretty good. I've also made this zebra pattern board that comes in handy when you're trying to track reflections and kind of tune up some of the surfaces. So you can just kind of control click and bring in whichever ones you want, and then you'll hit open and they'll pop up here. I've already done that, so these are the ones that I use. So I'm just going to switch that to red wax. So whenever you're in the default shaded viewport, it will pop up here. You can switch between your wireframe, solid, vertex map. We don't need that right now. Shaded, that's just kind of a default gray shader. I have a hotkey that I'm using on my mouse to toggle the wireframe on and off. I forget exactly what it is. I think it's control. If you hit control 1, you can have all these other things you could toggle on and off, and then control 2 will change some of those shaded modes. Control 3, there's some more stuff. Control 4 will bring up some more pie menus. You can customize those as well, but I'm going to stay in the default and use this red wax matte cap shader. So the next thing I'm going to do is come back to the item mode here, where your layer list, and I'm going to add a mesh. I'm going to start working in my own mesh item here to create new geometry. So I usually create the wheel arches first, and then I'll go into the Topology tab and start building off of those. So I think I did that in my last video, so I'm just going to switch to my back view here, I'm going to hold Control and click on the cylinder here. One thing before we start this, you want to just make sure your vehicle is the correct size. So when you have your mesh item selected there, hit View and Dimension Tool. Dimension Tool. It should give you your overall dimensions of your object. So actually, this does seem about correct. About 2 meters wide, 4.6 long. That's roughly all right. You can always scale the car later, if you don't get it right the first time, but I'm just going to leave it as is. I don't know exactly how big I'm going to make this car, but those numbers seem about right. Then I just hit Escape once and it drops that dimension visibility. So I'm going to come back into this mesh and rename it body. You can rename things or not. It's really up to you. That just helps identify things. 2 isn't getting selected. I'm just going to call this base. Base model. Alright, so we've got those, and I'm going to then just rotate this, make it 90 degrees, and I'll pull it out just a hair. I'm going to deselect just that cap and delete the rest of that. And then in side view, which is back here, I'm just going to move this up a little. I'll turn on shaded, and I will, in the polygon tab here, I'll just hit bevel. You could hit Shift B if you want to use the shortcuts. And then I'm just going to bevel it in and delete the center of that. So what I'm doing now is just making the wheel arch, getting a rough shape for it, and just start to align that. And then if you hit Shift Tab, it will subdivide it. And then we'll just get it kind of roughly in place. That looks pretty good. And I'm just going to delete some of these on the bottom and start to kind of flatten some of this stuff out just to shape this wheel arch. So I'm going to use some of the fall off tools. I'll just use the linear. I don't know why snapping's on. Pull that out and we will change the shape of it. So depending on the shape you define here, they have different effects. So I'm going to actually want to uncurl it, so we'll do ease out, so you can see that based on this shape here, when I start to move these, it will start to flatten it out that way. We'll do something like that, and then I'll drag this out a little bit more and kind of flatten that, and flatten this. Oops. Make sure your negative scale is off there. If you want to flatten something, if your negative scale over here is on, it will obviously go the opposite direction. So I just want to turn that off and flatten that, and then I'll move this out a little bit. We'll just make it a little wider, and that looks pretty good. This point is a little wide down there. It's not bad. I'm just going to flatten these out as well, just so it comes down. I'll kind of tune that up later. I'm noticing that the rocker is a lot lower than the front of the bumper. I must not have had those on the same height. So once I start building more geometry, I'll fix that height issue there. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Oops. Fall off linear and drag it out. So it'll affect at the widest point more. And we'll just uncurl that a little. And then I'm just going to manually move these. Scale it. I think I had a little more kind of curl under, or I made this tuck under a little bit more in the front. I'll probably want to make that consistent with the rear of the wheel arch. back here, so I think I'll leave it a little flatter as well. Like that. That looks pretty good. So when you hit Shift Tab, it'll smooth it out. Um, that looks all right. Maybe it's the wheel could be a little off center from where I want that, but that's okay. We can always move that stuff. The Gravity Sketch model was made, a little looser, and now I'm going to start refining this a little bit more and making things a little more accurate. You can see it's a little skinny here. Maybe I'll pull that this way. Usually the wheel arch flats are pretty consistent in size. That should be alright for that. So actually what I'll do is pick a height for the front and rear. Usually you'll have a little ramp angle, and this front might be a smidge higher than this rear. It looks like it's not too far off, and I'll just kind of average between the two of those and make it fairly flat. This is more of a race car, so I think it can have a nice flat kind of splitter area on the bottom of the vehicle, or diffusers. So that looks good. One thing I also like to change under the Surface tab here is the amount of subdivisions. The Catmull-Clark Shift tab, that's what I use. That's Catmull-Clark subdivision Shift tab, so you can see it's smoothing between those points. So I like to bump this up to 3 or 4, just to have a little denser mesh, underlying mesh. It'll be a little bit smoother. You can't really tell right now, but as I build more geometry, you'll be able to see that. So I leave that at 3. Maybe when I export it, it'll be 4. I can change that later as I build. Okay, so now I'm going to just copy and paste this to the rear. So Control C, Control V, W for move, and I'll just slide that back here. I think my mouse is dying the battery for it, and I'll just kind of roughly position that where I think it'll be. Looks like I actually, okay, that front is not quite on it, so I'm just going to pull the front in a little bit. What is that, about 10 millimeters, 12 millimeters? I think I'll just make the rear 10 millimeters wider, so I just move the front inboard a little bit. That's pretty good. So now I'm going to grab the front of the wheel arch and start to manipulate it to fit the curvature from here. So I'll switch to my front view, which, because the way I'm working, it's my right view. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is use the fall off tool, the linear fall off, drag it out. Oops, this has to be down here. Drag it out so I can affect pretty much from here down. I want to start tucking it under, so I'm going to hit W and start to bend that underneath there, and then you can manipulate this fall off widget, I guess we'll call it that, so you can see how it's affecting that line. I think somewhere like that'll work pretty well. Hit escape, drop it, and then we can I'm just going to leave that for now. I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to keep this curvature here at the rear. Once I get into building more geometry, I'll tune that later. And then the back as well. I think what I'll do is just grab the outer edge. Usually the rear wheel arch flats are slightly bigger, so I'm just going to hit the scale tool and bump that up. Maybe we'll make it another 5% bigger. Oop. So you want to hit this to do them all in the same direction. So we'll make it about 5% bigger, and we want maybe 3% bigger. That's a smidge. Again, make sure you constrain them all. You want this to all be equal, so it does it all in the same. We'll make that 3%. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'll be deleting probably these ones here, and then I'll make the back its own height. But I'll do that later, so I'll leave that for now. Then I come to the Topology tab and have the new body geometry mesh active. I'm just going to unsubdivide that. You want to just be careful which mode you're working in, subdivided or smooth mode versus your kind of control cage mode. You'll see the difference with those facets there. And then from here I'm going to start using the Topology pen tab. So since I've already got the wheel arches made, I'm going to start with that geometry. But if you don't have any geometry and you want to just start on the hood or anywhere else on the vehicle, you just hit the Topology pen, hold down Control, and drag across your model. And in the Topology pen tab, you can grab the face, the edge, or the vertex, and it will always stick to the underlying geometry. So you can see here, you can just drag it around. So that's pretty much what you're doing, is using the Topology tool to build new geometry while sticking to the underlying geometry you've imported or built, like I did in Gravity Sketch. So we'll just start dragging off geometry from here. I always like to start with the wheel arches because everything has to kind of blend into them, so it's easier to start with the hardest part. I think it's one of the harder parts to kind of bring everything to and make look good. So once you have your nice wheel arch established, you shouldn't really have to change it much. But like I said before, I'll likely bend this under to follow this curvature. But I think I'm going to want to add a light catcher here, as I did in my original sketch. So we'll see where that's going to happen. Anyway, so Topology pen, I just hold Shift, and you can start dragging out single points or single edges. If you do Shift right click, actually I'm just going to bring this one to here. So if you do Shift right click, it'll grab the entire row and pull out geometry from there. And then you can always snap your points to one another. If you want to create a triangle, you'll see where it turns purple there. That's it's snapping to itself, and once you let go, it'll be welded to it. But for this, I'm just going to leave that one out there, and I'm going to start dragging these ones as well. So that's the start of the fender. You can see it's a little taller than here, so I'm not going to add any more through here in the topology mode because I don't really want it to snap to that geometry under there. But I am just going to drag this out a little bit more. Just kind of tune these up, and then I'll hold right click while holding Shift, and it'll drag out that entire row. So that's pretty much the only tool I use is a topology pen. I also use it's called the add loop here. So if you want to add another row here to kind of snap to this underlying geometry, just switch to that tool, hold Shift, and it will drop down more loops. I'm just still holding Shift to add another one there, and then you can manipulate the geometry a little bit more. So I think that should do there. So I'm just going to do a time lapse of this. It's pretty repetitive. What you're trying to do is just create a clean geometry, so you can manipulate kind of the surfaces between all your design lines. So you can see I'm just pretty much making spans between all my hard edges. Across the hood I'll try and get nice curvature, and then kind of figuring out the topology I want in these areas will be a little tricky, but it's nice because you can focus on getting that nice clean topology to kind of flow with your surface design or just some of your details. They'll have to kind of follow these lines around these edges and this headlight and stuff like that. So this is good practice for establishing good clean topology that you can manipulate later on to kind of get a better surfacing and kind of morphing the proportions and kind of where things are with the design. So I'm just going to start doing this time lapse, and we'll pick up once I'm done with that, and I'll show you how I start manipulating the geometry and refining it away from this model. Okay, I'll see you guys soon.